when a broken woman loses everything. She believes her life is over, but a rugged cowboy's love will prove that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most unexpected hearts. The wind carried dust across the empty fields, whispering through broken fences, and the charred remains of what once had been a proud home. She stood there, motionless, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the splintered wood of the gate. This land had once belonged to her husband. Together, they had dreamed of a future here, a family, a legacy, a life full of promise. But now, all that remained was silence, a haunting echo of what could have been. Her husband was gone, taken by a fever that came swift and merciless. With him, her world collapsed. The house that once rang with laughter now felt like a coffin of memories. Neighbors who once brought warm bread and friendly smiles now avoided her eyes. Some pitied her. Others whispered behind her back. A widow with nothing to her name was not worth much in this land of harsh winters and harsher men. The town was no kinder. When she went to the market, women tugged their children closer, as if widowhood itself was a curse that might spread. Men offered sneers or cruel bargains, muttering that she would not survive on her own. Once, a farmer's wife had hissed she should sell the land. What good can a woman do with it? Her cheeks burned at their laughter, but she pressed her lips together, swallowing the anger and the shame. Night after night, she returned to her cabin, staring at the wooden beams above her bed, listening to the wind howl through the cracks. Hunger gnawed at her belly more often than food filled it, but worse than that was the emptiness in her heart. She had no children to hold her, no husband's arms to shield her, and no family left to comfort her. Only loneliness, thick and unrelenting, kept her company. Once, she tried to fix the barn roof herself. With trembling hands, she dragged the ladder into place. But when she slipped and scraped her arm, the blood only reminded her of how fragile she had become. There was no one to steady the ladder, no one to laugh at her clumsiness, no one to care. She sat on the cold ground for hours, staring at the sky until darkness swallowed her. The cruelest part was not the hunger, nor the cold, nor even the aching grief of losing her husband. It was the way people looked at her now, as if she was invisible, as if she was a burden, as if she was already dead. In their eyes, she was not a woman anymore. She was nothing. That night, as she sat by the dim glow of a dying fire, she pressed her face into her hands. Her body shook, but no tears came anymore. Grief had wrung them dry long ago. Her voice cracked in the silence, so faint it barely reached her own ears. I have nothing left. The marketplace was alive with noise and chatter, a sharp contrast to the silence of her lonely cabin. Horses snorted as they were tied to posts. Vendors called out their prices for cornmeal, beans, and salted pork, while women haggled loudly over bolts of cloth. She moved quietly among them, shoulders drawn in, her shawl pulled tight as though it could shield her from their stares. Every step felt heavy, every glance a reminder of how far she had fallen. She had come to trade the last of her hens for a small sack of flour. It wasn't much, but it would keep her alive for another week. When she placed the small cage on the stall, the merchant smirked. "Scrawny birds," he muttered, "barely worth half a sack." Her face flushed. "They're healthy. They still lay." The merchant laughed and waved his hand, not interested in excuses. "You'll take what I give, or walk away with nothing." Nearby, a pair of women giggled, whispering behind their gloves. "Poor thing," one said loudly enough to be heard. "Her man left her nothing but scraps." The other replied, "She should sell herself. Maybe then she'll have more than chickens to trade." Their cruel laughter stung, but she kept her head down. She had learned that pride didn't fill an empty stomach. What she didn't see was a tall figure leaning against the post across the road, a broad-shouldered man, dust clinging to his boots and the brim of his hat shadowing sharp eyes, had been watching the exchange. His jaw tightened at the sound of the women's mocking voices. The set at his shoulders carried the weight of miles ridden and burdens unspoken, but his gaze was steady, noble, and fierce. He stepped forward as the merchant pushed the sack of flour toward her, far smaller than what was fair. His voice cut through the noise, low and certain. "I'll take the rest of that flour." The merchant blinked up. "It's spoken for." The cowboy's eyes narrowed. "I'll pay double." He tossed a coin on the counter with a clink that silenced the stall. The merchant scrambled to agree, greed shining in his eyes. Confused, she looked up at the stranger for the first time. He was rugged, his face weathered by sun and wind, yet there was no mockery in his expression, only something she hadn't seen in a long time. Respect. He nodded slightly, as though he wasn't doing her a favor, but sharing an ordinary kindness between equals. When the flour was measured out, she realized he had quietly arranged for her portion to be heavier, more generous. She tried to protest, whispering, "I can't take this. I can't repay you." His lips tugged into the faintest smile. "Ma'am, no debt's been made. Folks around here forget decency, but I don't." She lowered her gaze, clutching the sack to her chest, a strange warmth spreading through her. The women who had laughed before now stood silent, their whispers cut short by the cowboy's presence. He tipped his hat to her politely, as though shielding her from their scorn, then stepped back into the crowd without asking for thanks. But she couldn't stop her eyes from following him. The way he walked, confident, unhurried, was different from the men she knew. He didn't carry cruelty or mockery in his stride. Instead, he carried something steadier, stronger, a quiet dignity. For the first time in many months, she felt the sting of tears not from shame or despair, but from something unfamiliar, hope. That night, as she poured the flour into her jar, her hands trembled. A stranger had seen her not as a burden, not as a widow, not as nothing, but as a woman who deserved fairness. And though he had vanished back into the noise of the town, his kindness lingered with her like the glow of a fading fire. She whispered into the silence of her cabin, "Why would he help me?" Yet deep down, something told her this was not the last time their paths would cross. The days after the marketplace passed slowly, each one marked by the same endless routine. She woke before dawn, gathered what little she could carry, and struggled to keep her fire alive. Her meals were small and plain, just enough to quiet the hunger gnawing at her belly. When she walked the creek to fetch water, villagers passed her with their eyes turned away, as if even greeting her might bring bad luck. The loneliness pressed down heavier than the cold. Yet in her mind, she could not forget the stranger with the steady eyes. More than his kindness, it was the way he had looked at her, without judgment, without pity, that lingered like an ember in the ashes of her heart. She told herself not to think about him, that men never gave without expecting something in return. Still, when the night was especially dark and the wind rattled her door, she wondered if she would ever see him again. The answer came sooner than she expected. One afternoon, as she bent over her garden patch pulling stubborn weeds, the sound of hoofbeats carried down the dirt road. She stood quickly, clutching her shawl tighter. A tall horse, dust-coated and strong, came into view, and on its back was a cowboy. His presence filled the empty space around her small home, as though the silence itself shifted when he dismounted. He tipped his hat politely. "Ma'am," he greeted, his voice even calm. She nodded, wary, not sure if she should feel relief or alarm at his sudden visit. "I was riding through," he continued. "Thought I'd see how you were faring." Her lips tightened. No one ever came to see her any more, not unless they wanted something. She forced herself to answer, "I managed well enough." His eyes dropped to the thin stack of wood near her porch, barely enough for one night's fire. He didn't argue, but the slight furrow in his brow betrayed his doubt. Over the next few days, he appeared again, sometimes with a small bag of beans, other times with a stack of wood already chopped. He never lingered, never pushed, only left what he could and tipped his hat before riding away. His quiet concern unsettled her. She had long grown used to scorn. Kindness felt more dangerous. One evening, as gray clouds gathered low on the horizon, he came once more. This time he did not carry food or wood. His gaze was steady, serious. "Storm's coming," he said. "Strong one. Your roof won't hold against it." Her heart thudded painfully. "I'll manage," she insisted, though her voice wavered. He shifted his hat in his hands, almost hesitant. "My cabin's sturdier. It's just up the ridge. You can wait it out there if you'd like." The offer stunned her. Shelter from him? Her instincts screamed caution. She had trusted before, and it had left her with nothing. Men made promises easily. Keeping them was another matter. She searched his face for a trace of mockery, of hidden intent, but all she found was patience, quiet and steady. "I don't want charity," she whispered, almost offensively. He shook his head. "It ain't charity. No one should weather a storm alone." Her chest tightened. The truth of his words cut through her fear, but still doubt lingered. Could she place herself under a man's roof again? Could she risk another betrayal? Her silence stretched long, broken only by the rustle of wind through the dry grass. Finally, with a shaky breath, she nodded, only until the storm passes. His jaw eased slightly, as though he had been holding his breath too. He gave no smile of triumph, only a respectful nod. Only until then. The ride to his cabin was quiet, the sky above them bruised with clouds. When they arrived, she was struck by its solitude. A small wooden cabin stood at the edge of the trees, smoke curling from its chimney. It was lonely, almost mournful, yet something about it felt solid, dependable, like the man who lived there. Inside, the air was warmer than she had known in weeks. The cabin smelled of pine and leather, its shelves neatly lined with jars of food, its fire burning steady in the hearth. She stood awkwardly near the door, afraid to disturb anything. He set aside his hat, lit a lantern, and motioned gently toward a chair. "You're safe here," he said simply, as though it was a promise carved into the walls themselves. She sat slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the chair. Safe. The word rang in her ears like something from another lifetime. Yet even as her body thawed from the cold, her heart remained cautious. Trust did not come easily anymore. She knew storms passed quickly, but wounds lingered. That night, as the wind howled outside and the rain lashed against the windows, she lay awake on the small cot he had prepared for her. The steady crackle of fire filled the silence. She turned her face to the wall, whispering into the dark, "Don't trust him. Don't trust anyone." But even as she repeated the warning to herself, she could not shake the memory of his words. No one should weather a storm alone. The storm raged through the night, rattling the cabin walls and roaring like a wounded beast across the mountains. But inside, the fire burned steady, casting a warm glow that softened the hard lines of the wooden walls. She sat near the hearth, her hands stretched toward the flames, trying to shake the chill from her bones. The cowboy moved quietly around the small room, setting a kettle on the fire, his presence steady and calm, like the cabin itself. For a long while, neither spoke. The crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind filled the silence between them. She kept her eyes fixed on the flames, wary of what words might pass if she let her guard slip. Yet there was something in the quiet, something different from the loneliness she had grown used to. This silence didn't mock her. It waited, patient and kind. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and gentle. "Storm like this makes a man think on the things he's lost." Her chest tightened. She knew what he was offering, not idle talk, but a bridge, a chance to share the weight she carried. Still, she hesitated. What good came of speaking wounds out loud? Words couldn't bring back the dead or mend the past. But as the minutes stretched, her defenses crumbled. She drew in a shaky breath. "I wasn't always like this," she began, her voice barely louder than the fire's hiss. "Once I had a home, a husband who dreamed of building something bigger than the both of us." Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to continue. "We planted fields, saved every penny, hoped for children one day. It wasn't much, but it was ours." Her hands trembled in her lap. The cowboy said nothing, only poured steaming water into 2 mugs and set one gently before her. She wrapped her fingers around it, not for the drink, but for the comfort of its warmth. Then the fever came. Took him in 3 days. The land, the neighbors, everything we built slipped through my fingers. I was left with debts I couldn't pay in mouths I didn't have the strength to feed. Folks who once smiled at me, they turned their backs. Her voice cracked. They whispered that maybe it was God's judgment, that maybe I'd done something wrong. And when I needed them most, they left me standing in ashes. She lowered her head, tears finally breaking free. That's what I am now. Ashes. For a long moment, only the storm outside answered her. Then, softly, the cowboy's chair creaked as he leaned forward. His voice, deep and steady, carried no pity, only understanding. "I know that kind of loss." Her wet eyes lifted to him, startled. He rarely spoke much of himself. He stared into the fire as though the flames held his memories. I had a brother once, younger than me. We ran this land together, thought we'd build something that would last. His jaw tightened, the shadow of grief darkening his eyes. One winter, blizzard came down hard. We thought we could beat it. We were wrong. He didn't make it back from the ridge. His voice went quieter. I buried in myself. The fire popped sharply, filling the silence between them. She swallowed, her heart aching with an unexpected kinship. His loss was different, yet it carried the same weight, the same hollowness that had eaten away at her. For the first time, she didn't feel alone in her pain. She whispered, "How did you go on?" He turned his gaze to her then, his eyes steady despite the storm raging outside. One day at a time, some days harder than others. But I reckon carrying on is the only way we honor the ones we lose. Her breath caught. No sermon, no empty promises, just truth. And strangely, it was enough. She felt something stir within her chest, faint and fragile, like a spark buried deep in the coals. The cabin grew quieter as the storm began to ease, though the firelight still danced across the walls. For the first time in years, she spoke freely, not as a widow scorned, not as a woman left with nothing, but as someone who was heard. And in return, he shared the pieces of himself he'd buried too deep for the world to see. By the time silence settled again, it was different from before. No longer a barrier, it was a bond. She sat across from him, the warmth of fire on her skin, the warmth of something deeper blooming in her heart. She didn't say it aloud, but she knew. The storm had taken much from her, but perhaps, here in this lonely cabin, it had given her something back, a hand to steady her, a heart that understood. And as the last gust of wind faded into the night, she let her eyes drift close with thought that frightened her almost as much as it comforted her. Maybe I'm not entirely alone anymore. Morning broke clear after the storm, the air sharp and cold, but clean. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and fresh coffee, and for the first time in months, she woke without dread pressing against her chest. When she stepped outside, the world seemed changed. Snow glistened on the pine branches, the field stretched white and still, and for a brief moment, it was almost beautiful. She wrapped her shawl tightly, her breath clouding in the air as she watched the cowboy saddle his horse. He looked up when he noticed her at the door, his eyes calm as ever. "Storm's past," he said simply. "But you'll need wood stacked high and the roof mended, else the next one will tear this place apart." His words were not pity, but practical truth, spoken with the steady tone of a man who saw what needed to be done and intended to do it. She hesitated. Pride whispered to refuse, to tell him she'd manage on her own. But her gaze fell on the broken shingles of her cabin roof, on the dwindling pile of logs by the door. She knew he was right. And when he added, "I'll help," his voice carried no expectation, no demand, only certainty. She found herself nodding before she could stop. That day they worked side by side. He split logs with steady, powerful swings, the axe biting clean into the wood. She gathered and stacked the pieces, her muscles straining but her heart lighter than it had been in months. At first, she spoke little, afraid of breaking the fragile peace between them. But gradually, words came easier. She asked about ranch work, and he told her cattle drives, of long nights under the stars, of land both harsh and beautiful. At noon, they paused by the fence, sharing bread he had brought. She caught herself watching the way he moved, calm, efficient, never wasting more than necessary. He treated her not as fragile or helpless, but as though her work mattered alongside his. It startled her, this simple respect. It had been so long since anyone had given her that. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shade of amber, they repaired the last of the shingles together. She steadied the ladder while he worked above. For a moment, his hand brushed hers as he passed a plank down. It was nothing, just a touch, but the warmth lingered against her skin long after. She looked away quickly, afraid he might see the rush of color in her cheeks. When the roof was finished and the wood neatly stacked, they stood outside the cabin, the quiet between them heavier than the work itself. She meant to thank him, to send him on his way before her heart betrayed her. But he spoke first. His voice was low, certain, almost solemn. "You should know something," he said, his eyes fixed on hers. "You'll never be treated as nothing again. Not while I'm here." The words struck deep, shattering walls she had built so carefully. She felt her throat tighten, her breath catch. No one had promised her anything since the day her husband was lowered into the ground. And yet here stood a man, steady and true, giving her a vow she hadn't dared hope for. Her heart ached with a dangerous warmth. Still, fear coiled inside her. Promises had broken her once before. What if this was no different? What if she believed and lost everything again? She lowered her gaze, fighting tears. "You don't know me," she whispered. "You don't know what I've lost." His reply came without hesitation. "I don't need to know every scar to see the strength in you. And I know this much, you're not nothing." She wanted to believe him. Oh, how she wanted to. But belief was a fragile thing, and she was afraid to hold it too tightly. So she only nodded, turning away before he could see her trembling lips. That evening, as they sat by the fire, silence filled the cabin once more. But it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was something softer, unspoken yet undeniable. Every glance, every accidental brush of hands carried a weight neither dared name. When she lay down that night, the echo of his vow repeated in her mind. "You'll never be treated as nothing again." She pressed her hands to her chest, feeling her heart beat faster than it had in years. Fear still lingered, sharp and cold, but beneath it burned something warmer, steadier. Hope. And as sleep claimed her, she knew, no matter how much she tried to deny it, the cowboy's vow had already begun to change her. The sky turned dark long before nightfall. Heavy clouds gathered low over the ridge, their bellies swollen with thunder. The air itself felt restless, charged, as a warning of what was to come. She stood by the cabin door, staring at the horizon, her shawl clutched tightly around her. The cowboy had noticed it too. He had paused his work, one hand resting on the fence rail, eyes narrowed toward the distant hills. "Storm's rolling in fast," he said, his voice grim, faster than it should this time of year. Before she could reply, the sharp sound of hooves echoed through the valley. Two horses galloped wild, eyes wide with fear, their reins trailing. Then came the shouts, angry, harsh voices carried by the wind. Bandits. She had heard of them before, men who roamed the edges of towns, taking what they pleased, leaving ruin in their wake. The cowboy's jaw set hard. "Stay inside," he ordered, already moving toward the barn where his rifle leaned against the wall. But she didn't stay inside. Her heart pounded, fear clawing at her, yet she couldn't just cower in the cabin while danger rode down upon them. She grabbed a bucket, running to the barn where the lantern still swung dimly from a beam. The cattle inside were restless, stamping and snorting, sensing the storm and the danger both. By the time the bandits reached the fence line, the first drops of rain were already falling. 3 of them, ragged and rough, with hard eyes that glinted like knives. One sneered as he dismounted. "Nice little spread you got here. Shame if it went up in flames." The cowboy leveled his rifle steady, voice calm but steel-edged. "You'll turn back now." Lightning flashed, thunder cracked, and the rain came harder. The standoff held in the downpour, tense and sharp. She watched from the barn, heart hammering, praying they would leave. But then one bandit spurred his horse toward the cabin, a torch in hand, fire sparking despite the rain. Without thinking, she ran forward, seizing the bucket of water she had filled from the well earlier. The torch met the cabin wall, but she was faster. She flung the water hard, dousing the flames before they could catch. The bandit cursed, swinging his arm toward her. Before his hand could land, the cowboy's shot rang out, shattering the night. The bandit's torch fell into the mud, snuffed out by the storm. The others, seeing their partner wounded and the storm growing fiercer, cursed and pulled back on their reins. Within moments, they vanished into the sheets of rain, leaving only hoofbeats and thunder behind. For a moment, everything was chaos, rain pouring, wind screaming, animals panicked in the barn. Together, she and the cowboy worked to calm the horses, speaking low and steady, guiding them back into place. Her arms ached, her dress soaked through, but she didn't stop. She moved with a determination she didn't know she had, matching his every effort. When at last the barn was secured and the storm began to ease, they leaned against the wooden wall, breathless and drenched. Rainwater dripped from his hat brim, sliding down the curve of his jaw. She realized then how close they were standing, so close she could feel the heat of him even through the chill. Her breath caught. His hand brushed hers, just barely, but it was enough to send a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the storm. For a moment, the world fell quiet, the thunder fading into the distance, leaving only the pounding of her heart. His eyes met hers, steady, searching, and she felt the weight of everything unspoken between them. He leaned closer, just enough for her to feel the promise of what might be. And for a heartbeat, she wanted nothing more than to close the distance. But fear, sharp and sudden, pulled her back. She turned her head, breaking the moment, though her heart still thundered as if the storm raged inside her. He didn't push. He simply straightened, his voice low and certain. "You were braver than most tonight. Braver than me, maybe." She shook her head, rain dripping from her hair. "I was just afraid of losing what little I have left." His gaze softened. "Don't call yourself little. You stood tall. You saved this place." Her lips trembled, but she held his eyes. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a shadow or a burden. She felt seen, needed. Later, as the storm finally broke and stars peeked to the torn clouds, she lay awake in the cabin, listening to the steady rhythm of the fire. Her muscles ached, her body heavy with exhaustion, but her heart felt strangely light. The memory of his words replayed in her mind, steady as his vow. "You saved this place." She turned onto her side, staring at the faint glow of embers. For the first time since her husband's death, she dared to whisper to herself, "Maybe I'm not nothing after all." The storm had passed, but its memory lingered. The earth outside the cabin smelled of wet soil and pine, the night air cool and sharp after the violence of thunder and rain. Inside, the fire burned low, its glow painting the wooden walls in shifting amber. She sat near the hearth, her shawl wrapped tight, though she wasn't cold. It was her thoughts that shivered, her heart caught between fear and hope, shadows and light. The cowboy entered quietly, setting his hat on the table. His shirt was still damp from the storm, his hair plastered against his forehead. For a moment, he simply stood there, watching her as though memorizing every detail. There was something different in his eyes tonight, softer, deeper, like a man on the edge of decision he could no longer hold back. "You should rest," she said, her voice low, trying to hide the tremble in it. "I can't," he replied simply. "Not until I say what I need to say." Her breath caught, and she turned her gaze to the fire. "You don't owe me anything. You've already done more than I deserve." "Don't," he said firmly, taking a step closer. "Don't talk about yourself like that. You think you're nothing, but you're wrong. You've been stronger than anyone I've ever known." Her eyes stung, and she blinked hard, fighting the tears. "I'm not strong. I'm just surviving." He knelt beside her, the weight of his presence impossible to ignore. "Then surviving is the bravest thing you've ever done. But I need you to hear me now." His hand rested lightly on the arm of the chair, close but not touching. His voice softened, rough with honesty. "I've carried loneliness for years. Buried myself in work, in silence, thinking it was easier that way. Then you walked into my life, broken, hurting, and somehow you made me realize I've been just as lost as you." She turned toward him slowly, her tears finally falling. His face was so close, lit by firelight. Every line and scar a testament to the life he'd lived. He wasn't polished, wasn't perfect, but in his eyes she saw something no one had ever given her before, steady, unshakable love. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "Every time I trusted, I was betrayed. Every time I loved, it was taken from me. I'm scared, more scared than I've ever been." He leaned closer, his voice a vow. "Then let me be the one who never leaves. Let me be the one who proves love doesn't always end in pain. You'll never be treated as nothing again, not while I'm here." The words broke through every wall she had built. A sob rose from her chest, raw and aching, and she covered her face with her hands. For so long she had carried her sorrow alone, hiding the cracks, pretending to be invisible. Now, with him, there was no need to hide. He gently pulled her hands away, his callous fingers warm against hers. "Look at me," he said softly. When her tear-streaked eyes finally met his, he whispered, "You're everything I've been waiting for." Her breath hitched, and in that fragile moment, something inside her shifted. Fear didn't vanish, but it loosened its grip. For the first time in years, she felt the possibility of belonging, of being cherished. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. When his lips finally touched hers, it was not the desperate kiss of hunger, but the tender seal of a promise. Soft at first, trembling with the weight of what it meant, then deeper, surer, as her hands clutched his shirt, pulling him closer. Tears mingled with the kiss, hers hot against his skin, his steady presence grounding her. She poured years of pain, loneliness, and hidden longing into that single moment, and he answered with strength, patience, and devotion. When they finally parted, breathless, she pressed her forehead against his chest, her body shaking with quiet sobs. He held her without hesitation, wrapping her in his arms, as though he could shield her from every cruel memory. "I don't deserve this," she whispered into the fabric of his shirt. "Yes, you do," he murmured into her hair, "more than anyone I've ever known." The fire crackled, the only sound in the quiet cabin, as they clung to each other. Outside, the world was still wet with storm, but inside, warmth bloomed where despair once lived. For a long while they didn't speak. They simply held on, two souls scarred, yet slowly stitching each other whole. His thumb traced circles against her back, steady and soothing, while her breathing softened, evening out against him. Finally, she pulled back just enough to meet his eyes again. Her cheeks were flushed, her lips trembling, but there was a new light in her gaze, a fragile hope, like dawn breaking to the remnants of night. "Don't let me go," she said, her voice breaking but sure. "Never," he promised, and kissed her once more, gentle, sealing the vow not with words but with a bond only hearts could make. That night, in the quiet cabin where loneliness had once lived, love was born. Not sudden, not fleeting, but rooted deep like the land itself. It was the kiss that changed everything, turning sorrow into strength, fear into trust, and two broken lives into one shared future. And as they lay together by the fire's glow, their hands entwined, she finally let herself believe in the truth of his vow. For the first time, she was no longer alone. The dawn spread gold over the wide fields, bathing the land in a warmth that felt like a promise. The storm that had once defined her life, the ridicule, the betrayal, the loneliness, now seemed like a distant shadow. She stood on the porch of the cabin, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, watching the ranch slowly stir awake. Horses stamped their hooves in the corral. Cattle moved like dark waves across the grass, and the smell of hay and leather filled the air. It was no longer his world alone. It was theirs. Once, she had nothing. She had been stripped of dignity, mocked in town, treated as if she was invisible. But here with him, every sunrise felt like a new beginning. The cabin behind her, once a place of emptiness and silence, now held laughter, shared meals, and the low murmur of whispered conversations by firelight. The cowboy stepped out beside her, his presence grounding her as always. He didn't need to say anything. His hand brushed against hers, rough and warm, and she understood everything in that simple touch. This was no longer charity, no longer pity. It was partnership, built from respect and quiet devotion. They worked side by side on a ranch, their rhythm growing steady and sure. She fed chickens in the morning, her laughter rising when the hens squawked too eagerly. He saddled horses, sometimes pausing to watch her, his lips curving with pride. In the afternoons, they fixed fences together, her small hands steadying the wood while his strength drove the nails. Sweat, dirt, and hard work painted their days, but never once did she feel less than him. Here, she was not a burden. She was a partner. The town began to notice. At first, whispers followed her when she rode in with him. Skeptical voices, mocking tones. But little by little, as they saw her working the land, standing tall beside the cowboy who never hit her, the whispers began to change. The same people who once jeered now nodded in respect, tipping hats, offering greetings. She no longer walked with her eyes lowered. She held her head high, not because society accepted her, but because she had accepted herself. There was a moment at the marketplace that would stay with her forever. A woman who had once spat cruel words at her stopped, clutching her basket awkwardly. Instead of venom, the woman offered a quiet morning. It wasn't much, but it was a crack in the wall that had once shut her out. The cowboy noticed her trembling, noticed the tears she blinked back, and quietly placed a hand at the small of her back, steadying her without a word. Back at the ranch, evenings were her favorite. The land glowed under the setting sun, shadows stretching long across the fields. They would sit by the fire together, shoulders brushing, their silence filled with comfort. Sometimes he would tell her about the hardships of his past, lost years, buried grief, and she would listen, her heart softening with each truth he shared. Other times, he simply looked at her as if to memorize her face, as though he couldn't quite believe she was real. And she too often found herself marveling at the change. She had thought her life was over, that she had been discarded like a forgotten thing. Yet here she was, standing in a place she now called home, her heart full of something she had never thought she would feel again, belonging. One evening, as rain gently tapped against the cabin roof, he took her hand across the table. His voice was low, roughened with sincerity. "I need you to hear this again," he said. "You'll never be treated as nothing again." Her throat tightened, tears shimmering in her eyes. "To me," he continued, squeezing her hand, "you're everything. You always will be." The words wrapped around her like the warmest embrace, sinking into the deepest places of her heart, where old scars still lingered. For so long, she had been desperate to be seen, to be valued. Now, she didn't have to beg for it. It was given freely, steadfastly, by the one man who had turned her brokenness into strength. Her lips trembled into a smile as she whispered, "And you're my home." His eyes softened, and he pulled her into his arms. They stayed there, listening to the rain, the crackle of the fire, the steady beat of each other's hearts. In that moment, the cabin no longer felt like a shelter from loneliness. It had become a house of love, carved out of hardship and stitched together by hope. The seasons shifted around them, but inside that cabin, the change was eternal. The woman who once whispered, "I have nothing left," now stood tall beside the man who gave her everything. And together, they built a life where pain had no final say, where love endured, where the cabin that once echoed with silence now sang with warmth, laughter, and a quiet vow that would never be broken. It was no longer her nothing. It was their everything.